presenter, Melissa Gutting, who has been working on a project called How Do You Say Addict? And I'll let you go over your subtitle and tell us more. And after her presentation, I will get to say a few words. Her advisor is in here today, although Dr. Lilly also supported this project. And yeah, I've been looking forward to this presentation for a long time. So thank you so much, Melissa, and I'll be back up to lead Q&A when you're done. Everyone, hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes. Perfect. Okay. So, Dr. Lilly introduced the beginning of my title, but to say the whole thing, to get everything started, how do you say addict? Exploring the language of substance use and addiction among college students. So first, I want to introduce you to some key terms and topics before going into all the stuff that I was doing for the past year or so. So, firstly, what is substance use? Two vague words put together, really. But, oh, did it go on itself? Oh, there we go. Okay. Sorry, guys. Essentially, whenever we talk about substance use in the healthcare world, clinical world, we're talking about the chemicals or materials that change the way a person thinks, feels, behaves. You might recognize some of those substances here: tobacco, alcohol, illicit, non-prescribed drugs. Tobacco isn't a substance that I will be going into very much in this presentation, but the other ones, yes. And so I was curious about how much of the substance is being used, how many people are using this substance. And so, to make it a little personal, first I looked at 18 to 25-year-old Americans, and we see that we tap out around 50% of use in the most predominant category being alcohol. But when we change the environment of where that substance is being used, where those people are coming from, such as US college students, we find that the substance use increases. But the category most fascinating to me and to y'all is the gold bar, which is us. This is the SEU student community reported from data in 2019. And we see that we're topping out our top three categories. These are the top three substances reported as students feeling expected to use here on campus. So alcohol, cannabis, and non-prescribed stimulants like alcohol. And so when we look at that figure, if we felt any kind of surprise or discomfort, we have to examine the stigma present in our lives. And so stigma can come in various forms. The US has tried to regulate substance use since its kind of inception, beginning. And that exists at a structural level. But the kind of stigma that I'll be looking into today is social stigma. This is the kind we're most familiar with, the kind that we can easily recognize in our social groups, our dynamics, friendships, and most importantly, in our day-to-day communications. So linguistically, when we use labels to describe people, there are two main camps when looking at the language of substance use and addiction particularly. The first one is what's known as substance-first language. It's the kind that most people are probably familiar with and might even use or hear a lot. That's the kind that has words like addict, substance abuser, junkie, alcoholic, words that put the substance ahead of personhood. And so, contrastly, we have person-first language, which is saying things like person with a substance use disorder, person in recovery. And the National Institute of Health actually issued communications in 2021 saying you should use person-first language when talking to people, when talking about people. This will reduce stigma among people that do use substances or have been diagnosed with some form of addiction. And so, why is the NIH going around saying this kind of stuff? Well, there is some merit to it. There's actually a communication theory known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, developed around 1929, early 1930s. It's the communication theory that argues that word choice can influence how people think, feel, behave, ironically much like substances themselves. And so when applying that to the language of substance use and addiction, we can see that substance-first language, arguably, will make us think of the substance first, rather than the person first. And another kind of facet to this whole theory is that the prevalence of concept or object in a certain environment increases the word choice or the word variability to things. So, again, applying this to the language of substance use and addiction, we can see that there are more terms to describe a particular substance if there's a higher prevalence of it in a community. But does the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis even apply? I couldn't find any research kind of discerning this or looking into this kind of thing, so I thought to myself, let me look into it. But how exactly do I go about doing that? Well, there we go. I had two main objectives. The first, oh my goodness, I swear the buttons, guys. The first was to identify word choice. What exactly are the kids saying these days, you know? So there's the national level, right? I talked about the NIH. They distributed communication of like common terms that are substance first or person first. But in the words of researcher John Kelly, I couldn't find a dictionary. So there wasn't any kind of working lexicon for campus communities among 18 to 25-year-olds where we see a large prevalence of substance use. And then secondly, those kinds of words or labels that are being used, do they have social stigma even? Does it influence a person's affect towards another person based on the way that they're referred to? So, the main way I went about doing this was with what I call the Howdy survey. You've seen this flyer around. Thank you for seeing it and taking it. This is my survey. It looked over things predominantly like substance use and expectations. That's where I got the information for our top 3 substances of alcohol, cannabis, non-prescribed stimulants, etc. And then most of it was open response just because I wanted to know what people thought. When prompted, what kind of direction do they go in linguistically? And then I also had these things called vignettes, which is what I've been kind of referring to as the stigma check. So they were short narratives. I have 3 of them. One would pertain to alcohol, marijuana, non-prescribed drugs, and they followed with Likert scale statements to gauge if someone did have a stigmatized affect towards another person based on the label. So a vignette would look like this. The bold underlined bit is the word or label that would be changed. So participant taking this survey that sees this would see it as an alcoholic, but somebody else takes it, it might see something like a person with an alcohol use disorder. So comparing and contrasting that person first versus substance first. And then on another side of things, so I have the Howdy survey, which, you know, is just blank text looking at me, doesn't have any kind of tone indicated in it. I don't know if they're being ironic or not. That's an important part of language, right? Is the way that we enunciate, inflect our voices, how we use humor, things like that. So I followed up with ethnographic interviews. They were optional, and didn't force everybody to do it. But the ones that did want to partake would have a one-on-one with me, and in it, I would ask them to elaborate or explain their views on campus culture and how they view substance use and addiction. Gave me the opportunity to ask clarifying questions on some tricky stuff that came up in the survey responses, which I'll go into later. And then also a chance for them to give testimonials about the way that they were feeling and the way that they were perceiving substance use in our community. And the interviews are still ongoing. I hope to conduct a few before the end of the semester. Now, what did we find out, guys? Let me tell you. Okay, so we have these heard and used terms and labels. I'm not highlighting every question, but these are kind of my greatest hits, as it were. So when we think of heard terms and phrases, alcoholic for alcohol use was, by and large, the greatest term that cropped up in the responses, which highlighted red because it is substance first language. And runner-up, tied with crazy, so I'm not quite sure how prevalent or relevant, you know, it could be, is person. So it's green because it's person first language. However, I do have the caveat that it was included in responses sometimes with like drunk person, party person. So there was ways to modify that person first language in responses. And then partier is yellow because it refers to ritual or social engagement, just kind of acts that you can do. And so alcoholic is heard a lot, but when asked, what do you use? It gets drinker, and sometimes, like a person, drinker is referred to as binge drinker, heavy drinker, stuff like that. And then people drops down a little bit, still in second place, but really the third most propped up term, frequent term that's used. And so we can see here that substance first language dominates the terms and labels regarding alcohol use. Now I also had some other responses, things like generally describing alcohol use, one person just straight up went athletes. And again, going back to I can't infer tone or inflection or humor, right? So I don't know if they're saying this like legitimately, if they're an athlete themselves, or if they're, buying into a stereotype and reporting that. And then there's other things like to the far right where I asked for how people are referring to people who drink to intoxication. Someone just said, I do not like it and I find it annoying, which doesn't necessarily answer the question, but does give me insight into the feelings and attitudes of people here on campus when we talk about people who drink to intoxication. So enlightening, if not a direct answer to my questions. With heard and used terms and labels for drug use, a lot of people have marijuana on the mind, okay? Saying things like stoner, hothead. You also see that person-first language drops down when compared to how we were talking about alcohol use, right? And it wasn't necessarily the responses that I got that intrigued me for drug use, but rather the lack thereof. Had a lot of people opt out of telling me terms and labels for drug use. Things like NA, I don't know, unsure. Interestingly, someone said nothing specific, someone who just smokes marijuana. Again, elaborating, if not, directly choosing to answer the question. Because I said drugs generally, which can include everything from heroin to ecstasy to marijuana, right? But we see that there's a prevalence of use of marijuana, of cannabis here on campus, so it makes sense that this is on participants' minds, right? And now we move on to our stigma check portion of the survey, right? So when looking at alcohol use, and the name of the individual that I use is your friends call Alex an alcoholic, a person with an alcohol use disorder, etc., right? So using these two bar graphs, we can see that the top left is explaining the social stigma of a person with alcohol use disorder versus a person that's called an alcoholic. And we see there isn't much variation between the two, okay? When I ran statistical analysis, I did not find any significant difference between the two, meaning that there isn't a whole lot of change going on between labels for alcohol use. Same kind of thing with cannabis use too. There's not a whole lot of variation between calling someone a person with a substance use disorder or calling someone a pothead. There isn't a whole lot of variation. But when I look at Adderall use specifically, I found one instance of significant difference. And that's when identifying excessive use. So that's that third bar on each of the bar graphs identifies excessive use. We see that on the bottom one that uses the label addict, there's a larger amount of stigma. That's the orange, red kind of areas. Larger amount of stigma towards these individuals. So identifying if they have a drug problem, if they misuse a substance. People are more likely to think so if they're called an addict versus a person with a substance use disorder. But everything else, I don't see a whole lot of variation going on, which I thought was interesting. So when we move on to what exactly do we get out of this whole survey, knowing how people are speaking, knowing the stigmatized affect of certain individuals, well, we know that students feel expected to use alcohol, marijuana, and Adderall here on campus. Is this after-work hypothesis supported? That's a complicated question. Again, I go back to the multifaceted portions of it, right? Because we know that there are a little bit of significance of people talking about or using the words addict versus a person with a substance use disorder, right? That only happens in one instance for one particular kind of stigma. And then also, we see, going back to the word choice variation that crops up as a result of prevalence of substance, we can see that drug use isn't as quote-unquote popular as alcohol use. Therefore, we don't see as many descriptors of it. So I guess in that sense, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is supported, but also not. So it's a complicated question that I would love to learn more about, look more into. So moving forward, I would love to look at hyperbolic speech, because when thinking about what the NIH has said of like substance first language, it's more stigmatizing, more objectification of a human being, things like that. But when compared against person first language in the SEU community, we don't see a whole lot of variation. We don't see an increase of objectification of a human being very much, right? So that leads me to think, well, maybe we're used to hyperbolic speech. Maybe we're used to people exaggerating a little bit, right? So we don't feel as stigmatizing or express that much stigma towards somebody. But, I don't know, more research is needed. Particularly on drug use. The fact I got so many people that did not report terms and labels makes me want to know what terms and labels are existing, what people are saying, really. And then also, you'll notice that stoner was a very popular label in the open response. Unfortunately, I did not test the label stoner in my vignettes, in my stigma check. So that's something I would love to go back and do. And then also saying, how do you say whatever term here? Because moving forward, sociolinguistic research isn't just about looking into addiction, looking into substance use. It can be looking into lots of different phrases for lots of different topics and issues and identities, etc. So that's something I would also look to moving forward. But yeah, so that's about the end of my presentation. I would like to acknowledge my advisor, Dr. Martinez. She's not here today, but she has helped me so much on this journey. I'd like to thank Dr. Wolf and the Honors Program for supporting me, and Dr. Kelly Green, who also is not here today, but really started me on my journey of looking into addiction and substance use. And every person who has supported and challenged me along the way, people that took my survey, friends, coworkers that listen to me talk about my research all the time, thank you very much. And yeah, that brings us to the time for questions, comments. So. Now's the time, guys, if anybody's curious about it.
I usually get up and say, are there questions, but
Melissa's so sorry. Yes.
So that graph at the beginning with the St. Ed students in
Yes.
comparison to college students in general, was that their actual use or sort of like what they felt expected?
It is the bar graph at the beginning, if I can like speed, go back to
it's
it.
going to be a long time.
But as I'm clicking back, I'll explain that it's reported use, not reported expectations of use. The categories that I include are based on the expectations that I received in the Hobby survey, but looking at the bar graph, it's actually information from a survey. Students in the room know that survey that was circulated a couple weeks ago that asked you a ton of different health questions, turned out by Reckwell, things like that. That is not the results of that current survey, but it's a similar one from a couple years ago.
So that's actual self-reporting.
Yes, yes.
So I guess my follow-up to that is, I'm curious particularly with the Adderall, why do you think the rates are kind of high on our campus? Like, do you think St. Ed students are just a little more honest about their use maybe, or do you think there's an actual difference between St. Ed's and other campuses?
I'm not sure. I don't know what other campuses are like in terms of their substance use culture, but I do know some of the reasons for engaging in Adderall use, especially non-prescribed, is to get that energy boost to either like complete tasks quickly. So something that happens is like deadline crisis. You're approaching a paper, it's due at 11:59 and it's like 9 p.m. and you have not started kind of thing. A way to engage in non-prescribed use is to take that Adderall then and feel that high energy, that rush to complete that task quickly and effectively. I'm not sure why SEU students report more use, though. That's something that I'll have to ask about more in my interviews, actually. But, yeah. Thank you. Yes?
how many responses did you get?
I had 98 respondents, so that's approximately like a little over 3% of SEU student enrollment. So, yeah. Good question, thank you. Yes?
How does it follow that? What would you do in the future to like get more response?
respondents, I think I would take more time to push out the survey. I really did kind of crunch everything together first with identifying word choice and then in that same survey testing different words for stigma. I think what I would do is, one, communicate with faculty more and see if they can distribute that survey to their students, and then also, I think, be more present on campus with, this survey is out, the survey exists, please take my survey, please and thank you, take my survey, kind of thing. But yeah. Yes?
Was the population I analyzed just SU students, or did it contain other, like UT or Hesseltosen?
Originally, I was over-ambitious, guys, with my research. I wanted to get responses from students from UT, from Houston-Tillotson, and St. Edwards. I ended up having respondents only from St. Edwards University. So the results that I showed you, the prevalence of stigma, the words that are reported, all SEU students from last spring and this fall. Yeah.
It is, oh, sorry, was there one more question?
I don't think so.
It is time. I'm sure there are more questions. Melissa, thank you so much. I'm not Melissa's advisor. I feel like I should be negatively credited because when Melissa told me last year that she wanted to do this project, I think I said some version of like, you don't have a sociolinguistics program.
Yeah.
This is so interesting. And you've just done such an incredible job pulling really different pockets of expertise on campus, developing so much of your own expertise and putting it together into such an important project. I'm so proud of this work. I also am just so proud of having had you in the honors program and supporting you in Berlin. And it is my absolute honor to give you the stole and cord that you'll wear at graduation. But please join me in congratulating